Led Zeppelin ruled the 1970s, filling stadiums and shattering ticket records worldwide. But Jimmy Page once let slip a secret. His true favorite band was never his legendary group. It was a scruffy outfit from Los Angeles that most casual listeners had never heard of. Its brilliant leader would be dead within a decade, brought down by heart failure at only 34. Robert Plant blamed them for a police complaint against Zeppelin. Behind that praise, a heavier story was waiting. The interview lasted more than 8 hours, spread across 2 separate days. Rolling Stone sat down with Jimmy Page for one of the longest conversations of his career, covering nearly 6 decades of music. Reporters expected the usual answers. They expected Page to talk about his own records, his own riffs, his own place at the top of rock history. Instead, something else happened. When the conversation turned to the music that shaped him personally, Page did not mention Led Zeppelin at all. He skipped past the obvious choices. No mention of his own multi-platinum catalog. No mention of the songs that filled stadiums for a decade straight. According to that widely cited interview, Page named a completely different band as his true favorite. A band most casual rock fans had never heard of. A band that never sold out an arena in its life. For a man whose guitar work helped define an entire genre, this was a strange thing to admit out loud. Page had spent close to 6 decades working alongside some of the most celebrated musicians alive. He had every reason to point back at his own legacy. He didn't. If your favorite artist admitted their real inspiration wasn't the band that made them famous, would that change how you see their music? Tell us below. The band Page chose had a much messier story than Led Zeppelin ever did. Shorter, sadder, and almost completely unknown outside a small circle of devoted fans. What made Page pick them over his own legendary group was still a mystery. And the reason behind that choice was about to get a lot stranger. Building the Empire. On December 26, 1968, Led Zeppelin walked on stage for their first American show in Denver, Colorado. There was no slow build. Within 2 years, the band was already one of the biggest live acts on the entire planet. Sold-out arenas. Screaming crowds. A sound nobody else had. Jimmy Page didn't just help build that sound. He believed it was the best rock music had ever produced. In a retrospective published by Far Out magazine, Page made a bold claim about his own band. He argued that, as a collaborative musical unit, Led Zeppelin outclassed even the Beatles. Not because of one genius songwriter. Not because of a single standout voice. For musicians, one shared sound. That, according to Page, was what made a band truly great. It was a confident statement. Maybe even an arrogant one. But it came from a man who had watched his band sell out venues across 2 continents in under 2 years. A man who had every right to believe his own group set the standard. That belief made his later confession even harder to explain. If Led Zeppelin really stood alone in Page's mind, as the greatest collaborative band in rock history, something didn't add up. Why would his personal favorite band live somewhere else entirely? Why would a guitarist who helped define stadium rock choose a group that never filled one? The answer wasn't about ego. It wasn't about rivalry either. It was about something Page valued more than record sales or ticket numbers. And the band that earned that respect was about to enter the story. The band no one expected. The band Jimmy Page picked over his own was called Little Feat. It started in Los Angeles in 1969, built around a singer and guitarist named Lowell George. Before starting his own group, George had spent time playing with Frank Zappa's band, the Mothers of Invention. He left that group to build something of his own, something rougher and looser than anything on the radio at the time. Little Feat's sound didn't fit neatly into one category. It blended blues, folk, and soul into something swampy and unpolished. According to retrospectives written about the band, their style earned comparisons to the Grateful Dead, another group known more for a devoted following than for chart-topping hits. Little Feat never had Zeppelin stadium crowds. They never had platinum sales numbers to point to. What they had instead was a small, fiercely loyal fanbase, and one very unexpected admirer sitting at the top of the rock world. Jimmy Page wasn't alone in his admiration either. Robert Plant, Led Zeppelin's own frontman, was reportedly just as obsessed with the band. Two members of the biggest rock group on the planet, quietly devoted to a band that couldn't fill a fraction of their own venues. On paper, it sounds harmless. A musical crush. Nothing more. But that admiration didn't stay harmless for long. According to accounts from the same interview where Page named his favorite band, Plant's love for Little Feat ended up causing an actual problem for Led Zeppelin. Not a rumor. Not a rivalry. A real, documented incident. What exactly happened next would turn a simple musical crush into a moment of genuine embarrassment for one of the biggest bands on earth. A feud nobody saw coming. In the same Rolling Stone interview where Jimmy Page named his favorite band, Robert Plant added a detail nobody expected. According to that account, the United States Attorney General had once filed a complaint with a Los Angeles hotel. The complaint wasn't about drugs, or property damage, or any of the usual chaos tied to Led Zeppelin's reputation. It was about noise. Specifically about Little Feat's records being played far too loud, coming from the floor below. The floor where Led Zeppelin themselves were staying. Two of the most famous rock musicians on the planet, the men widely blamed for some of the wildest excess in 1970s music, were, at least once, the actual source of a noise complaint. And the reason wasn't their own music. It was someone else's band. A band most hotel staff, and most of the country, had never even heard of. If you want to know how a noise complaint against Led Zeppelin actually happened, hit subscribe. This story only gets stranger from here. It sounds almost funny on the surface. A small, strange footnote buried inside two massive careers. But underneath the humor was something far less light-hearted. The band Page and Plant loved enough to blast at top volume, loud enough to draw a federal complaint, never got anywhere close to that level of fame themselves. No hit records. No headline tours. Just a small circle of devoted fans, and two rock icons quietly cheering from the sidelines. Within just a few years, the reason behind that gap would become painfully clear. And it had nothing to do with talent. The final bow. Little Feat's story never got the arena-filling ending that Led Zeppelin's did. Lowell George, the band's founder, was born on April 13, 1945. He died on June 29, 1979, at just 34 years old. Barely a decade after starting the band that Jimmy Page called his personal favorite, George was gone. According to reporting from that period, George suffered fatal chest pains at a hotel in Arlington, Virginia. He had just finished a solo show at Washington, D.C.'s Listener Auditorium the night before. He was pronounced dead the following day. Accounts from those close to the situation describe years of heavy drug use and worsening health problems building toward that final collapse. Not a sudden tragedy. A slow one, watched from a distance by people who loved his music but couldn't stop what was happening to him. The band Page had praised as better than his own, better than the group that filled stadiums across 2 continents, lost its creative center almost overnight. Little Feat carried on without George for a while, but the sound that first caught Page's attention belonged to one man. And that man was gone years before Led Zeppelin's own story reached its end. Maybe you've loved an artist or band that never got the recognition it deserved, while something bigger stole the spotlight instead. It raised a question Jimmy Page never fully answered in public. What did it mean to admire a band that much, while watching it quietly fall apart from a distance? The answer said less about Little Feat than it did about what Page valued in music all along. And that answer was still waiting, one chapter away. What it all means. Decades after that Rolling Stone interview, Jimmy Page's admiration for Little Feat never faded. Long after Led Zeppelin broke up, he kept describing the band as his favorite American group. According to interviews collected on the subject, Page continued name-checking guitarists tied to that same era, still pointing back to a band that most of the world had already forgotten. This wasn't a passing compliment. It wasn't nostalgia for a rival, either. It was a genuine, lasting judgment, coming from a man whose own band is routinely ranked among the greatest of all time, decades after their final show. For Jimmy Page, greatness apparently wasn't only measured in arenas filled, records sold, or headlines written. It was measured in something quieter. A sound that felt honest, even if almost nobody was listening. That is the less-told story hiding behind one of the loudest bands of the 1970s. Even the guitarist who helped build Led Zeppelin's legend understood something most fans never considered. Bigger didn't always mean better. Fame didn't always line up with talent. And sometimes, the artist people call the greatest of all time is quietly pointing somewhere else entirely, toward a band nobody else was watching. Little Feat wasn't the only band a rock legend secretly rated over his own. In the next video, the story turns to Robert Plant, and the artist he believes deserves far more credit than Led Zeppelin ever got.